the receipt doesn't lie. What changed isn't the price of one thing. It's the price of everything. Groceries, electricity, insurance, rent, all at once, all moving in the same direction. And when everything moves together like that, the problem isn't out there in the market, scattered across 100 different industries. The problem is upstream. And upstream, there is exactly one lever. That's what this video is about. Not the politics, not the villain of the week. The lever, what it is, who controls it, and how a man named Milton Friedman described its operation with such precision, decades before you felt it on your grocery receipt, that reading his words today feels less like economic theory and more like reading your mail. Here's the question I want you to hold. Did anyone see this coming? Not in hindsight, not after the damage was done. Before, in writing, with their name on it. Keep that question, we're going to answer it. But first, we need to demolish the explanation you've been given. You've heard the story. Inflation is complicated. It's a global phenomenon. It's the supply chain, disrupted by a pandemic. It's corporate greed, companies raising prices because they can. It's the war in Ukraine driving up energy costs. It's just the way things go when the economy gets overheated. These explanations have one thing in common. They point outward, to events, to villains, to forces beyond anyone's control, or at least beyond anyone you can hold accountable. Inflation, in this telling, is something that happens to an economy, like weather happens to a city. Complicated, regrettable, and essentially nobody's fault. There's a problem with this story. If corporate greed causes inflation, you'd expect the greedy companies to be the ones raising prices the most. But in an inflationary period, prices rise across industries that have nothing to do with each other. Hardware stores and haircuts, car parts and chicken. Greed doesn't coordinate that uniformly across millions of transactions. And supply chain disruptions affect specific goods. They can cause shortages. They can cause price spikes in targeted sectors, but they cannot cause the general, sustained, across-the-board price increases that define true inflation. Something else has to explain why the dollar in your pocket buys less of everything. Milton Friedman explained it in 1960, not as a political argument, as a description of a mechanism. Here's the mechanism. In plain English, think of the economy as a room with a fixed number of chairs and a growing number of people trying to sit in them. If you double the number of people without adding any chairs, the price of a chair goes up. That's not greed, that's arithmetic. Money is the same. When the total supply of money in an economy grows faster than the total supply of goods and services that money is chasing, prices rise. Not because anyone is cheating. Because each dollar in a world with more dollars in the same number of goods is worth a little less than it was yesterday. Friedman stated this with a precision that has never been successfully refuted. Inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon in the sense that it is and can be produced only by a more rapid increase in the quantity of money than in output. He wrote that in 1970, restating what he'd first argued a decade earlier. Not sometimes, not in certain conditions, always, everywhere, a monetary phenomenon. That's the mechanism. It means that to find the cause of inflation, you don't look at corporate boardrooms or shipping containers or geopolitical events. You look at the quantity of money, and then you ask, who controls that? Before we get there, though, there's a chapter of history that most people have been taught exactly backward, and it changes everything about how you read the present. Most Americans were taught that the Great Depression proved capitalism doesn't work, that unregulated markets collapsed under their own weight in 1929, and only massive government intervention pulled the country back from the edge. That's the story. It's in the textbooks. Friedman and his colleague Anna Schwartz spent years in the archives of the Federal Reserve. What they found, documented in their landmark 1963 study, A Monetary History of the United States, was something completely different. The economy contracted sharply after 1929. That's not in dispute. What's in dispute is why it turned into a decade-long catastrophe instead of a painful but temporary correction. Friedman and Schwartz's answer: the Federal Reserve allowed the money supply to collapse by roughly one-third between 1929 and 1933. Banks failed. Credit dried up. Instead of supplying liquidity to stop the contraction, the Fed stood by, or made it worse. The Depression wasn't capitalism failing. It was the same mechanism running in reverse. Too little money chasing too many goods doesn't cause inflation. It causes deflation, then stagnation, then the breadlines your grandparents remembered. Here's why this matters for today. It confirms the mechanism from both sides. Expand money faster than output, you get inflation. Contract money faster than output, you get depression. The lever runs both directions, and someone has their hand on it. Which brings us to August 15th, 1971. That's the date. If you want to understand every inflation debate of the last 50 years, including the one that hit your grocery bill, that is the date that changed the architecture. On that evening, President Nixon went on television and announced that the United States would no longer convert dollars to gold at a fixed rate. This ended what was known as the Bretton Woods system, the post-World War II agreement that had tied the dollar to gold and gold to a fixed price, which meant any country holding American dollars could exchange them for a physical asset. It was a constraint. It meant the United States couldn't simply print unlimited money without consequence, because the supply of money was tethered, however imperfectly, to something finite. Nixon cut that tether in one address, without a vote in Congress. He called it a temporary measure. The word temporary in Washington, as Friedman observed more than once, tends to have a peculiar half-life. Friedman had been watching this with the clear-eyed attention of someone who understood what the lever did. In his Newsweek columns in the early 1970s, he documented the monetary expansion that followed Nixon's decision, the Federal Reserve increasing the money supply at rates well above the growth in actual economic output. He didn't predict catastrophe in vague terms. He described the mechanism at work and noted, methodically, what that mechanism produced. Here is what the record shows followed. By 1979, the annual inflation rate in the United States was 13.5%. Not a spike, a sustained, grinding erosion of purchasing power that lasted nearly a decade. People who had saved carefully, lived within their means, done everything right, watched the value of those savings quietly diminish. No robbery, no dramatic moment. Just the slow arithmetic of a dollar that bought less every year. Friedman had described this outcome before it arrived. He had named the mechanism. He had identified the decision. The record confirmed him. If this framework is resonating, if you've known something was wrong, but couldn't hold the full argument together under pressure, that's exactly what the Friedman decoder is built for. 30 economic arguments, each one sourced to the historical record, written in the same plain English you'd use at a dinner table. One argument per page, ready when the conversation starts. The link is in the description. Now I want you to think about a specific period. The year is 2020. A global pandemic shuts down large portions of the economy. Congress authorizes trillions of dollars in federal spending. Relief payments, expanded unemployment, business loans, extended subsidies. The Federal Reserve, in coordination, keeps interest rates near zero and expands its balance sheet dramatically. Between early 2020 and early 2022, the M2 money supply, the broad measure of money circulating in the American economy, grew by roughly 40%. 40% in 2 years. Meanwhile, the supply of actual goods and services, the chairs in the room, did not grow by 40%. It contracted, then slowly recovered. Here's what the Bureau of Labor Statistics recorded. By June of 2022, the Consumer Price Index had risen 9.1% year over year, the highest inflation reading in 40 years. People were stunned. Politicians called it a mystery. Some blamed the supply chain. Some blamed oil companies. Some blamed the previous administration. Some blamed the current one. But Friedman's framework wasn't stunned. Friedman's framework had been waiting. When you increase the quantity of money more rapidly than the quantity of goods and services, you get inflation. He wrote that sentence in 1970. He was describing a mechanism, not a moment. And the mechanism, indifferent to the name of the president, indifferent to the party in power, indifferent to the stated good intentions of every official who authorized the expansion, ran exactly as described. That's the question you asked at the beginning of this video. Did anyone see this coming? Not in hindsight. Before? The answer is yes. 50 years before, in writing, with his name on it. There's a moment in the history of Milton Friedman that doesn't appear in most of the content you'll find about him online. It's a moment of genuine intellectual honesty, and it matters here because it tells you something about why his economic framework is worth trusting. During World War II, Friedman worked for the US Treasury. He was young, he was brilliant, and he helped design something that would later become one of the most efficient mechanisms the government ever built for collecting tax revenue: payroll withholding. The system where your employer deducts your income tax before you ever see the money, so you never feel the full weight of what's leaving your paycheck. Friedman later called this one of the things he most regretted in his professional life. The system he helped create made taxation nearly invisible, which made it nearly painless, which made it dramatically easier for government to expand its claims on your income without triggering the resistance that a visible annual bill would have produced. He understood the mechanism he'd built, and he said so. That's not the biography of a partisan warrior. That's the biography of an honest man who followed his framework even when it implicated his own decisions. It's worth knowing, because when a thinker is willing to face his own paradoxes honestly, you can trust him on the things he was right about. So here is where we are. The mechanism is not complicated. More money chasing the same goods produces higher prices, always, everywhere, without exception. The lever that controls the money supply is not in a boardroom. It's not in a supply chain. It is in the institutional decisions of the Federal Reserve and the fiscal decisions of Congress, the authorization to spend and the accommodation to fund that spending by expanding the money supply. Nixon's decision in 1971 removed the external constraint that had kept those decisions partially in check. Friedman documented the consequences in real time. The 1970s confirmed his framework with 13 years of sustained inflation. And then, in 2020 and 2021, the same institutional logic, massive spending authorization, monetary expansion to support it, no binding constraint on the quantity of money, ran the mechanism again. The viewer who felt it in 2022 on the grocery receipt at the gas station in the quiet recalculation of what savings actually buy was not confused, was not oversensitive, was not misreading the economy. The arithmetic confirms you, the historical record confirms you. And a man who died in 2006 had already written the explanation you needed, in terms plain enough to repeat at a dinner table. Judge by the results, not the intentions. That's the mechanism. The results are in. One question remains, and it's the one that tends to sit with people after they've understood all of this. If the mechanism is this clear, if the documentation is this thorough, if Friedman said it in 1960, and the 70s proved it, and the 20s proved it again, why do we keep needing to relearn it? That's not a rhetorical question. It has an answer, and it's not a comfortable one. The same institutional structure that benefits from obscuring the mechanism also controls a significant portion of the vocabulary used to discuss it. When inflation is complicated, nobody is accountable. When it's a monetary phenomenon with a documented author and a predictable outcome, someone has to answer for the decision. Friedman understood this too. He spent decades arguing not just for a different policy, but for a different structure, one that removed discretion from the institutions whose incentives pointed toward expansion. He called for a fixed rule governing money supply growth, precisely because he knew that institutions left to their own judgment would not reliably restrain themselves. He was right about the mechanism, he was right about the prediction, he was right about the incentives. The record of history is clear. The question is whether enough people can read it. Tell me, which Friedman argument do you wish every member of Congress had to read aloud before casting a spending vote?